Justin Trudeau. And that's what he believes too. And so it's been an honor to work with him, an honor to serve this country, and I'm going to continue to do that for as long as all of you let me do that. And please help me welcome, with Thunder Bay pride, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Patty, for your kind words and your hard work as our Minister of Labour and Employment, and also of the great local MP. Thank you for being here. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to thank Don Rusnak and thank him not just for his extraordinary service, but the continued dedication he brings to absolutely everything he does. Where are you, Don? There you are. We're going to miss you, obviously, but I understand how important it is to get the balance right between family. And I saw your two wonderful kids earlier today, and I totally understand how important it is to make sure that you're doing everything you can to give them the right upbringing. It's tough to be a kid whose father is in politics. I happen to know that, so I always have a respect for people who make those decisions. Being here with Bob Nault is absolutely wonderful. Michael Gravel, all these great friends who we have here, but mostly all of you. This is probably one of my very favorite things. This is an exercise in pure democracy and what it actually should be, which is people coming together to talk about the future of their country, the future of their communities, ask questions of the person or people who are there with a responsibility to represent them, to serve them, and also, and this is the part that isn't as obvious when you come into this, you're also here to listen to the questions that your neighbors and fellow citizens also have. Because understanding the concerns and the issues and the perspectives that your neighbors and fellow citizens bring is also a really important part in the political process. Because we are a country, and indeed communities, of tremendous diversity of backgrounds, of religions, of perspectives, of languages, but also of opinions and ideologies. And the more we can actually listen to each other and understand where we're coming from and what we're concerned about, the more, yes, we understand the differences, but the more we get reminded of the fact that we all want the same kinds of things for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, for our world. And the opportunities to come together and hear contrasting perspectives and challenge each other on things that matter and understand perhaps a little better how the team you chose over the past 4 years to serve this country, and hopefully how we will be able to continue serving you into the future, if that's what Canadians decide, is part of the process that we have to be aware of. The thing that frustrates me a little bit is that politics doesn't do town halls as often as it should. Politicians find it hard to get out and just open up the doors and have people come in with a whole range of different perspectives and try and answer as many different questions as you can. And I don't do this because I think I have all the answers, because I sure don't. But I fundamentally do this because I end up learning more about what people in Thunder Bay and across the country think about different issues and what they're concerned about, and how I am doing at actually responding to those concerns, and secondly, actually putting together a plan and a team that's going to be able to build for a stronger future for us all. So that, for me, there's a little bit of selfishness in this, because I love and I need, if I'm going to be able to continue to do this well, to hear from all of you. So I'm really excited about getting into it. And the one thing I will say is that I really only have one sort of principle that I really try to hang to in this, is that I want everyone in here to respect each other in their times of question. I'm going to pick people to ask questions totally at random. I'll try and get to as many people as I possibly can. But when someone has a question, please respect their right to ask the question and get an answer to that question. Respect for our fellow citizens is one of those core things that does us so well in this country, and we do it better than just about any other country in the world, and that's what I found right across the country in these town halls, and that's why one of the reasons I love to continue to do this with all of you. Je veux aussi dire qu'évidemment, on est un pays bilingue. Si vous avez une question en français, soyez à l'aise de la porter, de la poser. On a de la traduction simultanée. We have simultaneous translation, so if you want to listen in both official languages, you can. I also want to highlight that we do have ASL interpretation for people with difficulty hearing. So this is about being accessible to as many people as possible, and I'm really looking forward to it. With that, let's get into a first question, and we'll start with this section here. You, sir, in the glasses. You were quick to put up your hands.
Thank you very much.
Sir.
Good evening, Mr. Prime Minister. I would like to start by applauding your ratification of the Kigali Amendment of the Montreal Protocol, which phases out the refrigerant HFC that is a potent greenhouse gas. As you might know, this is Drawdown.org's #1 solution for reversing climate change. It shows your commitment to tackling the most urgent challenge in mankind's history. As you might know, Drawdown.org's third solution is eliminating food waste. I'm asking you, Mr. Prime Minister, if you are willing to step up to the plate and follow France's lead in imposing a law on all grocery stores, banning them from disposing of any food that is still edible and forcing them to give the food to charities or food banks.
That is a great idea. That is one that I'd heard spoken of before, but wasted food, we know from supermarkets or restaurants or even in our own homes, is something that in this part of the world, far too many of us take for granted. I used to do a lot of work with a food bank in Montreal where I saw the amount of surplus food that supermarkets and different organizations had. And we did a lot of good job in sort of drawing down in a very voluntary way, getting people to reduce their waste and make good use of it. But I think there is a role for us as a society and indeed as governments to look into that. I don't know exactly whether it would be municipal or provincial or federal to do, but I certainly know that it is something that we could look at, and I would be very interested in looking at it. I think that's an excellent proposal, and we'll see what we can do about that. Merci beaucoup pour ta question. Thank you. Another question from the same section. You in the black shirt.
Hi. First of all, thank you for showing up only a day before, our ring ceremony. It's a great graduation gift getting to meet you. Now, I have a bit of an industrial question because I'm a mechanical engineering student. So we're buying the F-35 fighter jet, and we've spent a lot of money on it. In the past, when we bought the CF-18, quite a bit of it was made in Canada. We machined quite a bit of its parts and whatnot. I was wondering, how much of the F-35 will we be building in Canada so that people like me could work on it in the next few years? I don't want it to be an exclusively American adventure,
Listen, great question. And obviously, when our government procures for our military or as a government any sorts of equipment, whether it's fleets of vehicles or ships or airplanes, we're always stuck with that question of we want to get the best possible price for the best possible product for the men and women who serve in our military. But we also want to make sure that there are benefits to jobs in Canada. And getting that balance right is always the tricky part around government procurement. We want to get a really good price, but we also want to make sure that there's lots of good Canadian jobs created through it. And that's where the procurement process and the open competitions are really important, because it's a challenge, we say, to the makers of those products. Okay, we want to pay a good price and we want to have industrial benefits in Canada. So when it comes to the procurement of fighter jets, which we've committed to, we need to renew our fighter jet fleet, and we have committed to that in our Strong, Secure, Engaged defense plan. We actually haven't picked which fighter jet we're going to buy. Now, we are part of the F-35 development process and have been for about a little over a decade now, which means we are part of the development of the plane, and we have industrial spin-offs in various places across the country, but it does not oblige us to buy that plane. Now, the Conservatives made a bit of a mess of the procurement process. You might remember the parliamentary budgetary officer criticizing them for massive cost overruns on the F-35 projections. We are actually holding an open competition in which there will be 4 or 5 different models of aircraft that we will make an evaluation on based on Canada's needs, based on the price, based on what we expect to need in the coming years, and based on what is the right fighter jet for Canada. So we haven't made a determination yet what that will be, but I can tell you a part of it is making sure that we have good jobs for our aerospace industry in Canada. Aerospace is one of those areas where Canadian workers, Canadian engineering, Canadian innovation is world-class. Indeed, you can see it in the C-Series aircraft that was just purchased by Airbus as being one of the great new airplanes that is out there. It's actually one of the more or less direct competitors of the Boeing Supermax 737 that is facing such difficulties right now. So the Canadian aerospace industry has a potential to continue to boom, and there'll be lots of great jobs for engineers as we see that. Question from this section here as we move around. Yes, you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I was wondering, from me and my friend, when do you plan to bring better mental health initiatives to northern communities in Ontario and mostly towards the students throughout Canada?
That's a really great question, and it's one of the things that I have to admit I've been most impressed with as a pattern through these town halls over the past 3 years, that invariably it is a young person who stands up to ask about supports for mental health. And if we think back to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when I was in high school, it was not something that was generally talked about. I mean, my mom has struggled with mental illness all her life, and I've seen the stigmatization that surrounds it, and to see so many young people being strong and active voices on doing a better job of tackling mental health issues is really, really transforming the way we think about it as a society, and as is so many of the cases, young people are leading the way. A couple of years ago, we renegotiated the health accords with the provinces. And one of the things we did when we did that, agreed to send more money to the provinces for the health accords, for the delivery of health care across the country, we brought in 2 extra things that we had committed in the election campaign we were going to do. We put about $5 billion towards better home care, because we know with the aging population, the institutional model of putting people in institutions and hospital beds isn't either the best for many people's quality of life, and it's certainly not the best for the costs. Most people want to spend more time at home, surrounded by the loved ones, living independently as long as they can, and have services come to their home so that they don't have to be 24 hours a day in an institution, but just, have a nurse or an aid worker come and do the things that are needed when either their family can't be there or when they need that help. So investing in home care was a big piece of it. But the other piece was mental health. We put $5 billion towards mental health, a first in moving tangibly forward. And one of the things we realized in studies and working with the provinces is perhaps the best use of those mental health dollars is actually to focus on young people. We know when someone struggles with mental health throughout their lives, and because of the prevalence, I think absolutely everyone in this room has a friend, a family member, or a coworker who has or will struggle with mental health throughout their lives. But most of the times, the first episodes or indications or symptoms or challenges around mental health happen between the ages of about 15 and 25. And if you can give young people the supports and the help to start tackling it, addressing it, learning about it, learning to live with it, learning to counter it when they are young, you are much more likely to be able to have them live much better, happier, more fulfilled, more contributing lives throughout the course of their life. So one of the big shifts we are trying to make is to do more in general on mental health for young people. Now, when you talk specifically about more remote or rural areas, we know, particularly when it comes to Indigenous communities, we're facing mental health challenges around youth that in many cases are wrapped up in a suicide epidemic, in addictions, in some tremendous problems. And that's where investments we've made in Jordan's Principle, investments we've made in countering in suicide prevention programs, in sending mental health caseworkers and emergency workers to more communities is really important. But it's not just a question of mental health, it's a question of investing in housing and education and entrepreneurship and opportunities and a whole range of things to start really moving down that path of reconciliation. But yes, mental health is a big piece of it, and the more we can talk about it, the more we can address it, the more we can destigmatize it, the more we can give people the tools to be able to thrive despite some challenges, the better off we're all going to be. Thank you very much for your question. Another question from this section. You, sir, in the back, blue shirt.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Trudeau, my name is Cody. I'm a student here at Lakehead University. I'm also a recently elected city councillor here in Thunder Bay. I have a question for you about SNC-Lavalin. I'm sure you have had many questions about this recently, but I just want to know, on a personal level for you, we all have the ability of hindsight. We can all look back on things. I was wondering if, you know, over the past few weeks, looking back on things, are there things that you would have liked to have done differently? And through your reflections also, what things have you learned about yourself and how you might take those things that you've learned to be a better leader going forward?
Listen, thank you, Cody, for the question, and it's a great one. The day I stop learning on this job is the day I need to hang up my gloves. The challenges we have in doing any job requires us to be open and to think about what we could do differently, what we could do better. And that has certainly been something that we've been reflecting on. And that's why one of the things that has come through this issue is a reflection on, we brought in a special advisor to look at the question of whether it is a good idea to separate the role of Attorney General and Minister of Justice, as some countries do, as other countries do not, but I think it's a valid question that we need to ask. There's a question about how we do a better job of keeping the communications flowing properly through my office, to me, between caucus members, make sure that everyone is being listened to when they have concerns to bring up, that they don't feel that they can't somehow come and talk about that. These are all things that we've reflected on, and all things that I would hope to be able to improve, and I am busy improving on the way forward. But at the same time, I mean, government is always filled with really difficult decisions and difficult choices. And this was a situation in which there was a pretty serious difference of opinion and perspective on the best way forward. And everyone involved was trying to do the right thing in terms of trying to make sure that we're protecting good jobs and protecting workers right across the country at the same time as we're respecting the rules of our institutions and respecting the independence of the rule of law. And as we move forward on that, it's not always going to happen the best ways, and certainly this has been a difficult situation. But at the same time, I think as we go through tough situations, you figure out how to do better the next time, how to fix some of the challenges that came up so they don't happen again, and you learn to recommit yourselves to what you actually believe in and how you want to deliver it for people. So these past few weeks have been tough on the party. Anytime you have good, strong, passionate people in a disagreement around the best way forward or what happens, that's a learning experience. But at the same time, I have to say, as we look at the big things that we're continuing to do and continuing to focus on, like what we brought forward in the budget over these past few days, and what we still have to do as a government, and what we're going to be talking about in the coming election, that we want to continue to be able to do to keep this country on the right track and keep defending the strength of our democracy. And one thing that I think some people pointed out as perhaps a weakness in this issue that I see as a real strength is that I believe, and you've all heard me say this probably before, that diversity is a strength in our country, but also in a political party. That just doesn't mean diversity of backgrounds or religions or geographies. It also means a diversity of points of view. Having people around you who do disagree, who agree on the big things we need to do, but have different perspectives on how best to get there. It's tougher than being surrounded by a whole bunch of people who think exactly the same thing and never disagree. But it's also a better way of figuring out how to represent and serve a country that it is itself filled with different perspectives and different points of view. So I'm not going to back down on bringing in strong people and asking them to run for us with very strong ideas about what is right and what needs to be done, because it is through those conversations. And yes, looks like we're going to have to manage those conversations a little better in the future, and that's certainly something that I believe. But it is something that we're going to continue to do, because I fundamentally believe that that challenge and that diversity ultimately makes us better at what we do. Thank you, Cody, for your question. Okay. One last question. You in the middle. Yes. Here, just her right, a little further forward.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening, Mr. Prime Minister.
Alaikum salam.
And respectable ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bushra Mughal, and I'm doing PhD Electrical Engineering from Lakehead University under supervision of Dr. Salama Ikki. I'm an international student, and my home country is Pakistan. Mr. Prime Minister, I actually don't have any question today, but I need to say something. And I would like to thank you very much for your truly kind words, support, and gesture of love and acceptance and respect towards all the Muslims around the world after New Zealand massacre. When I heard your speech, being a Muslim and resident of Canada, it was the most proud moment for me that Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Justin Trudeau, has addressed Muslims. Undoubtedly, your words matter. They affect and they impact. Mr. Prime Minister, I thank you very much, and I must say in the end that because of the way you have addressed Muslim community in your speech, undoubtedly I feel more secure among all the countries in Canada right now. So, thank you very much, and I think this is the, I'm feeling extremely thankful that I have got this chance of saying this to you. And I think I would have never said this otherwise. I would have never thanked you like this, in this way. And my father, he is retired wing commander of Pakistan Air Force, and he has said me that I should deliver this message to you in behalf of him and our whole family and obviously whole Muslim community. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, we live in a world that is kind of scary sometimes, where we see terrible, horrific, hate-filled tragedies and attacks and terror attacks happening around the world. We had one here in Canada 2 years ago where 6 men were gunned down in a mosque just outside of Quebec City just because they were Muslims. And what happened in Christchurch is yet another example of the intolerance and hatred that does exist. But at the same time, we know that those actions that we see and we reel at do not represent who we are, not just as Canadians, but as human beings. I think as we meet people around the world, around the country, as you talk to people, you realize that people are fundamentally good and want the best for themselves and their neighbors and their communities. At the same time, we are in a time of transformation, of stress, of globalization, of economies changing, of people uncertain about their future, of tensions because of climate, because of resource depletion, because of economic gaps and knowledge and spread of information and misinformation and tools of hatred that are used on the internet in ways that we hadn't seen before, that can make a lot of people feel unsafe. But to see, whether it's a terrible house fire that killed 7 kids seven immigrant kids in Halifax a few months ago, or a terrible terrorist attack, or whatever tragedies hit different communities, to see the communities come together and be there for each other and learn to lean on each other and to support each other. We are reminded that for every hateful tweet we see or every comment board that we shouldn't have looked at on the internet, Canadians and people all around the world want to live in a better, peaceful, more respectful, more open world. And every chance we get, we step up and prove that those who want to bring out what is most vile amongst us will always fail, because we are always ready to step up and show what is very best among us with our actions and with our reaches out. And so that's just what we have the opportunity to do in Canada, and what we can be doing more around the world. Merci. A question from this section. Yeah, you, sir, in red.
First of all,
yeah, it's good. No, it's on.
okay, sorry. So first of all, obviously, thank you for coming to Thunder Bay. I don't necessarily remember the last time that you were here, maybe 3 years ago or something.
A couple years ago, yeah.
But thank you for coming anyways. It's good to see political representation up here.
You have some great political representation up here full time, but
definitely. But obviously, like on a bigger scale, the Prime Minister, obviously. So thank you for coming, first of all. And I hate to go back to the question, but I also kind of like it. The SNC-Lavalin scandal, obviously, lots of questions. Another follow-up. So you just mentioned how, on the last answer that you gave to Cody over there, you were saying how you were protecting the jobs, right? That's in the common narrative. You're protecting the 9,000 jobs that SNC employs across Canada and in Quebec. Well, the SNC-Lavalin CEO said this week he never raised the issue of jobs with you and your team, yet that's what everyone seems to be saying, is this and that's the reason for all of this. So how does that work? And then just a little follow-up there. So if nothing inappropriate really happened, why have 2 former ministers quit? Your staff member quit, your clerk quit, and another MP the other day quit. It just doesn't seem to add up, and I think I don't think I'm the only one in this room that thinks that. Thank you.
Okay. Sure. Well, let's actually go back, because I think a lot of people I've spoken to aren't exactly sure what this whole thing is about. And at the simplest possible level, there's a question of the Attorney General of Canada has an opportunity when a company is facing criminal charges for behavior in the past to say, instead of applying criminal charges, let's give you massive penalties and financial sanctions instead, and not cause you to go through the challenges of criminal sanctions which have direct impact not just on your ability to do business in Canada, but your ability to do business around the world. Now, in the Lavalin situation, there were some terrible decisions made by a former board of directors, by former leadership of the company, that were then fired and are some on their way to jail. And the company has worked very hard over the past few years to try and clean up its act and has done significant jobs on that. Now, there are 10,000 or so Lavalin jobs right across the country, 9,000, 10,000, in all sorts of different places around the country. And if the company were to go through full criminal prosecutions, those jobs absolutely could be at risk. So, one of the things that we looked at, because one of our responsibilities, what people expect of their government, is to try and say, okay, how are we going to protect workers who had nothing to do with the bad decisions made by the leaders of the company, and we don't want the workers to be penalized for it. So we said there is this tool called deferred prosecutions that is not letting the company off. It is making sure there are consequences, but in a way that doesn't necessarily punish the workers. Now, we had discussions with the Attorney General through the course of the fall on this exact issue. The Attorney General, the former Attorney General, as she said in her testimony, was directly told by me that it was her decision to make. But at the same time, it's also a decision that can be visited and revisited all the way up to the end of the trial. And because of that, we kept having discussions about it, because we really didn't want to see all these jobs potentially at risk and, yes, potentially lost. So the former Attorney General and I and our office have a bit of a difference of opinion on whether or not the conversations we continued to have, even after Jody Wilson-Raybould, the former Attorney General, made her decision, whether or not they were appropriate decisions to continue to have. And on that, we heard testimony from the clerk and from my former principal secretary and from others that say there was no inappropriate pressure. And we heard testimony from her that said there was inappropriate pressure. And that's a bit of a, well, that's obviously a disagreement. And I respect very much that the former Attorney General felt that things were inappropriate, but I disagree. But these are the kinds of calls you have to make in government, where you're trying to do multiple things at the same time. Protect jobs and, of course, protect our institutions. So, in the process that has unfolded, one of the limitations that the former Attorney General was facing was that because of cabinet confidentiality, which is the fact that members of cabinet don't get to talk publicly about decisions that are taken or policy issues that are discussed, combined with the fact of attorney-client or solicitor-client privilege, which, because Jody Wilson-Raybould was the Attorney General to Canada, or the government's lawyer, meant that we were wrapped up in issues of privilege, of that privilege as well. So, the former Attorney General was in a position where she actually couldn't speak to what she had felt she went through because of those limits. And obviously, that doesn't seem fair. So we took what is for any government very rare, so as to actually never happened before, that we waived both solicitor-client privilege and cabinet confidentiality so she could speak fully to what she experienced as Attorney General in regards to the SNC-Lavalin file. And she did that for a number of hours at the Justice Committee, a committee that studied the issue and heard from witnesses over the course of 5 weeks. that is sort of where we stand right now. And Jody Wilson-Raybould and Selena Caesar-Chavannes and Dr. Jane Philpott have made decisions about their own positioning and their own perspective on this that I absolutely respect, but to a certain extent I disagree with. Now, given this situation, it has had a Justice Committee looking into it, that is having an Ethics Commissioner looking into it as well, because we have an Ethics Commissioner who's an officer of Parliament to make sure that regardless of the partisan discussions going on, there is a objective look at what actually happened and not, and we trust those processes. Of course, we're hearing an awful lot about this right now, both because it is an issue that goes to fundamental governance, that balance between respecting institutions and doing the job of protecting jobs that Canadians expect us to do and growing the economy, but also because we're in a political situation, as we saw over the past couple of days, of 30 hours of voting, where we have opponents across the way who actually don't want us to be talking about anything else except this. I mean, we haven't even had a debate on the budget. And usually, regardless of the government, a budget that lays out the economic forecast and the path of the country and the programs we're investing in is a pretty big thing for parliamentarians to weigh in on. But we have a situation where the Conservatives don't even want to talk about it right now and don't want anyone else talking about it, so they're trying to amplify this particular discussion. At one point, I've sort of said, well, we're going to have to agree to disagree on these various perspectives, and we're going to have to keep focusing on the things that really matter most to Canadians in their daily lives, part of which is, yes, respect for our institutions and the rule of law, but as was said many times throughout this, the rule of law has been entirely upheld. Our institutions continue to stand strong in this country. There was no breaking of laws anywhere in this, and nobody is saying that. So we also have to get to the business of governing. We also have to get with the business of investing in Canadians and continuing to grow the economy as we have over the past few days. And that is very much what we're going to continue to focus on. And Canadians, conveniently perhaps, will have the opportunity in a few months to make a choice, to look at the entire record of this government, to look at the plans we have for the next mandate, to look at the plans our opponents have for our economy, for our future, and make a choice. Because that is what an election is. It's a choice between leaders, it's a choice between teams, and it's a choice between plans for how to continue to grow the economy and give people opportunities. And I look forward to that opportunity for Canadians to make that choice. Another question. You, sir, in the tie. Yes.
Good evening, everyone. My Honorable Prime Minister, I just want to thank you. A lot of people here, newcomers, they did not know who is the person opened the door for this country. That is my beloved Pierre Trudeau. That's your dad. My brother was friend to him, and I want to tell all newcomers, please stand for honesty and dignity. Arabic words say, Ehdina Siratal Mustaqim, means guide us straight path. I was in a state, lived there, because they are not straightforward. That is because I come to this country. Please, my Prime Minister, we are there for you. We will be there for you forever. Please help us here and outside this country. There's a lot of bad government all over the world. Please help us free Palestine, Kashmir. Also help us from India, pressuring all neighboring country and terrorizing. Please help us, and we love you, and we'll continue love you and your ideology. Thank you, sir. And this is my daughter. She wants to say thank you.
Hello, daughter. Hi there. Thank you. Do you have a question? Hello. Do you have a question?
My name is Samiha Fairdas, and I just have to say I'm really proud for Canada and having you as our Prime Minister, and I'd always like you to be our Prime Minister.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you be 18 by October 21st? Another question. Yes, you. Yeah.
Good evening, Prime Minister Trudeau, and my name is Courtney Stroud. I'm a Master's of Education student here, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. Globally, climate leaders have set ambitious targets backed by specific policies, investments, and efficiency plans. Our current federal greenhouse gas emission targets remain at the weak level put in place by the Harper government, and our post-economy investment dollars that are needed to support meeting these targets are being spent on pipelines. As a voter, I cannot accept commitments that remain unambitious and defy the danger that climate change represents to all global citizens. What specific and ambitious targets and policies will the Liberals offer to the youth who are rallying and to the citizens who are disillusioned by the government's inaction on climate change?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that question. No, it was incredibly inspiring to see young people mobilized all around the world to stand up for climate action, because that is something that we absolutely need to do, because there's a few things we have to all agree on. I can't believe I have to say this, but climate change is real, and it's a massive threat to our lives, our ecosystems, our economy, our futures. And we've known, governments have known for a long time that this is something we have to address as opposed to push off to next generations. But unfortunately, governments of all different stripes, including Liberal governments, have been very good about setting targets, but not so great about concrete action on fighting climate change. And much of the global conversations have always been around reduction targets, because if you think about it, if you just have a 4-year mandate, you can pretty much put whatever target you like in the window and leave it to someone else to hit that target 10 years later or not, as the case has consistently been. But we heard from the IPCC report we have only about a dozen years to prevent the 2% rise in temperatures, or even the 1.5% rise in global average temperatures that is looking at a real trigger point and a real tipping point. So there is no question we have to act. So the question becomes how to act. What is it that we can do to actually bend the curve on our emissions, to get those emissions reduced? Because quite frankly, what the targets are important as a guideline and an inspiration, but actually bending those curves and moving towards those targets and actually reducing emissions is the first and most essential step if you're going to actually do it. And that allows you to then be more and more ambitious once you start going in the right direction. And as we've seen, unfortunately, in Canada, Ontario government, there are still people who don't believe we have to take real action on climate change. The first thing we did, well, in this mandate, was explain that there was going to be a pan-Canadian plan to fight climate change, and every province had the opportunity to do its part in its way. BC has had a carbon tax for about 10 years, and not only has it reduced its emissions, but it is the fastest growing economy in the country, or one of the fastest growing economies in the country. The other one is Quebec, that has had a cap and trade system for about the same amount of time. His economy is doing very well and emissions are low. So we know that actually putting a price on pollution is the most powerful tool for changing behaviors. I mean, the problem is we have too much pollution in our atmosphere, and the reason we have too much pollution in our atmosphere has been that putting that pollution in the atmosphere has been free. So why would a company invest in new mechanisms that doesn't emit, or in better filters or better processes that are reducing their emissions, if it doesn't cost them anything to actually put out that pollution? So we have determined that we will be putting a price on pollution right across the country. And unfortunately, there are 4 provinces so far, coincidentally or not, all led by conservative politicians, including right here in Ontario, that refuse to move forward and put a price on pollution. They want to make pollution free again. We're not going to do that. So what we have said is, in the provinces that will not move forward on pricing pollution, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to be bringing in a price on pollution, and we are going to be making it affordable for families to make these changes in our economy. So right now is tax time. The average family of 4, filling out your taxes, you're going to get $307 back on your taxes, which is more than the average family will be paying out because of the new price on pollution. Why does that make a difference, do you say, if we're taking out and putting in roughly or equivalent the same amount of money? It's because it changes behavior on the polluter's side. It becomes more cost efficient for companies that pollute to look for more innovating ways to pollute less, and it actually starts changing the way we make business decisions about pollutions right across the country. So we are putting a price on pollution, making it affordable for families. But that's not all we're doing. We're moving forward with a world-class oceans protection plan that does a better job of protecting our coasts. We're moving forward on historic investments in renewable energies. We're giving incentives for zero-emission vehicles. We're moving forward on home and building retrofits. We're moving forward in a lot of ways that are going to be fighting climate change. But to get to the other element of your question, we are still an economy and a society that is, for the time being, continuing to rely on fossil fuels, on oil. We have to get beyond that. We have to innovate, we have to decarbonify, or at least lower our carbon emissions and our dependency on oil and gas. But we're not there yet, and we won't be there for a few more years. So in the meantime, we have to continue to do the best possible job of reducing our emissions profile, including more fuel efficiency and better extraction and cleaning processes for our fossil fuels, which, quite frankly, the oil sands are already doing a good job on. And we also have to make sure we are getting the best possible price for our oil resources while they are needed around the world and in our country, so that we can pay for the changes we're making towards more renewable energies. And since we do have oil resources, the choices are putting them on tanker trucks, putting it on trains, or putting it in a modern pipeline. And pipelines remain the safest way to export our oil resources. We are going to continue to invest in good jobs right across the country and growing our economy while we fight climate change. There are people out there who still think there's a choice to be made between the economy and the environment. And I believe, like most Canadians, I think, believe, that the only way to build a strong economy for the future is to be responsible about the environment, but the only way to protect the environment is to have the economic room and capacity to invest in the technologies and the innovations that are going to continue to protect our environment, and that's what we're doing. Thank you very much for your question. Another question. You in the very back with the blonde hair. Yes.
Good evening, Mr. Prime Minister. My name is Elizabeth Coppin, and I'm a high school student here in Thunder Bay. First, I'd like to thank you for giving people in my community the ability to speak to you directly about our concerns. Youth are our future, so it is important that they are receiving the best possible education. I fear that this will not be so with Premier Doug Ford's proposed changes. Some of these changes include increased class size, mandatory e-learning classes, banning cell phones, and blatantly targeting arts programs. Having said that, what are your thoughts on Doug Ford's changes to the Ontario education system, especially since you are a former high school teacher?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is a tough one because as a prime minister, as a federal politician who is originally from Quebec, so I'm very sensitive to areas of provincial jurisdiction, I recognize and respect that delivery of K-12 education is a provincial responsibility. So I have to be very careful about what I say as a prime minister, as a former teacher. But I'm also a dad who has 3 kids in the Ontario public system. My 5-year-old is in JK in an Ottawa public school, and the Premier has threatened to cancel junior kindergarten. And I have a daughter in grade 5 and a son in grade 6. So the class size question in the Ontario public school system really does affect me, and I'm allowed to have an opinion on that. And I think it's easy for any politician to say, you know, our youth are our future, and we need to invest in them, we need to do the right things, and we cannot, shortchange our kids, and education is important, and any politician can say that. So let's look at actual actions. While Doug Ford is making cuts to student aid programs, talking about increasing class sizes, going after certain programs, going after some of the strengths in what have been hard fought for in a great education system in Ontario for many decades. On the federal side, we're choosing to invest in young people. We're choosing to invest in a Kids Can Code program that's going to give more coding opportunities to kids in elementary school, because that's going to be so important for everyone's job in the coming decades. We're moving forward on supporting second language education, parce que notre défense pour les francophones en Ontario doit continuer. We need to defend Franco-Ontarians and Francophone minorities right across the country. We have more tools around post-secondary education, which is why we're increasing bursaries and grants for low-income and middle-income family students by 50%. We're reducing the amount of interest paid on student loans. We're actually giving a 6-month grace period in this last budget for you to start paying your student loans. And you don't have to start paying your student loans until you're making at least $25,000 a year, thanks to changes we made in a budget a few years ago. We're investing millions of dollars in boosting the trades, because in apprenticeships and better trainings, because we know there are so many great jobs out there in the trades that people are not accessing because of lack of training and lack of understanding that there are great career paths to have there. We also created something called the Canada Training Benefit, which I personally am really excited about, because it's not just about education, it's also about everyone in the workforce who is looking at the transformations of the workforce and says, you know, I really need to pick up some new skills if I'm going to get a promotion, or if I'm going to find a better job, or if I'm going to adapt to the new reality of the workforce. But what are people mostly lacking if they're in a job and they want training, want to take some training? Well, you're lacking both money to do it, and you're lacking the time to do it. So the new Canada Training Benefit, which we've put forward in this budget, what I'm really excited about, because I think it's an innovative way to solve these challenges, will give you a $250 credit every year over the course of 4 years. So every 4 years, you'll have $1,000 to spend on a training program. And every year, you will accumulate 1 week, up to 4 weeks over 4 years, of time that you can qualify for EI to get income support while you step away from your job to get training. So we're giving people both the money and the time to train and improve their job prospects and their skills for their jobs at any point in their life. And that includes people working in any industry. Now, small businesses might be worried that they're going to be dinged for that cost of training. So let me tell you, we're actually giving a EI rebate to small businesses so they don't have to pay the cost of these new training programs that all citizens are going to be able to benefit from. So this is a piece of how we understand that investing in education, not just for young people, but for everyone, is key to making sure that all Canadians can contribute fully to our economy in the coming years. So we're always going to defend education, even if Doug Ford isn't. Another question. You, sir, in the toque. Yep, right in the back row. The hat.
First off, thank you for coming to Thunder Bay to address our needs, Mr. Prime Minister. My name is Eunice, and I am a student at Lakehead University. As a civil engineering student, I had a concern with the Trans-Canada Highway. The Highway 17 that runs through Thunder Bay is the only highway connecting Eastern and Western Canada. It's also one of the most dangerous highways to drive on in the winter due to its icy conditions and size, with it being a 2-lane highway. Recently, I've read that there might be plans to widen the highway to make it safer for travelers and truck drivers, but I also read that there's no definitive plan for this. My question is, will the Department of Transportation invest in upgrading Highway 17 in the near future?
Great question. On infrastructure, we know that investing in our roads, our bridges, our buildings, our houses, our schools, our hospitals is something that the government continues to need to do. Indeed, we have underinvested in infrastructure many times by many multiples over the past years. And that's why in 2015, when we got elected, we said we were going to do something differently from the other governments. We weren't going to be preoccupied with the other parties. We weren't going to be preoccupied with balancing the budget at all costs. We were instead going to be investing in our communities, investing in the middle class to be able to grow the economy. And in parenthesis, it's worked really well over the past 3 years because Canadians have created over 900,000 new jobs. We've got the lowest unemployment in 40 years. We've lifted 300,000 kids and a total of 825,000 Canadians out of poverty over the past few years because of the investments we chose to make instead of cuts to program like, unfortunately, the other parties were offering. So we're very pleased with that. But the investment in infrastructure was also really key, because investments in smart infrastructure creates both jobs in the immediate in construction and design and engineering, but end up creating economic growth and prosperity over the long term. You have a better transit system, you have a better road system, you have a better housing stock, you have the better hospitals. That improves the quality of life and the productivity and the production of our entire economy. So these are the things that we invest in. But one of the things we'd always seen, particularly under the previous government, was the federal government played favorites. You know, this particular riding gets an investment. We want the subway line to pass through this particular area. We're going to give you lots of money, but it has to be for this specific purpose. And we said, you know what? That doesn't work. We need to instead trust the people on the ground, trust the municipalities, trust the provinces to make the right decisions about what it is they need. And that's exactly what we did. With our infrastructure investments right across the country, we've said, you know, it's got to be the right program for you, but you tell us what it is you need as your priorities. And that's what we've been doing over the past few years. We've been responding to the needs for public transit infrastructure that municipalities and provinces have brought forward. We have been working with partners to make the right investments. And that's what we'll do on highway expansions and issues. We'll listen to local municipalities, local partners, and in the case of provincial and interprovincial highways, we'll take our responsibilities as well, and we'll work with the provinces. One of the problems we've faced very recently, though, is what do we do if the provincial government doesn't want to invest in infrastructure? We have a situation where municipalities across the province of Ontario, and indeed across the country, have been asking us for more infrastructure dollars, but the province won't submit projects to us. So we're continuing, including with this intervention here, to encourage Queen's Park to, yes, submit projects so we can actually invest the dollars, the $11 billion or so we've put forward for infrastructure in the things that Ontarians are going to need. But at the same time, we're not just going to wait on the province, and that's why we've actually directly doubled the amount of money flowing to municipalities directly from the federal government for their use in infrastructure. So Thunder Bay, for example, will get about $13.8 million, which is twice as much as it had last year with the gas tax transfer, which is just an infrastructure transfer for the municipalities. So on any project, including a twinning of highways, we will work with the local partners, but we are there to be partners on priorities that local municipalities and provinces put forward. We can't do much, though, if the province itself doesn't want to prioritize the kinds of investments that we are ready to partner with them on. So I'm going to continue to push on the province to actually get money invested in communities and cities right across this province and across the country. Thank you for your question. Coming over to you in the pink shirt, second row.
Is this thing on? All right. First of all, thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for letting me speak. My name is Parmita, and I'm an elementary school student in Thunder Bay. Results have shown that test results have shown that mathematic results are declining. And since this is becoming quite a widespread issue, does your government have anything to say about this?
Absolutely. As a former math teacher, let me say that I have plenty to say about it. No, obviously, as I said earlier, the provincial jurisdiction over education, particularly K-12 education, is something we absolutely respect. But we also feel, I think as a government, I think people feel it as a country as well, that education is really, really important. And as people will be traveling for work or to live right across the country, we need to make sure there is quality education right across the country. So we have looked at different ways of making sure that schools have the investments they need to prepare their students for the future, and that's where I mentioned it briefly. The Kids Can Code initiative is a way for the federal government to directly fund through this organization resources for teachers and schools in elementary schools to give coding programs and STEM programs for kids, because we know that preparing our young people, regardless of what their potential career path may be, with a better and more solid grounding in computer coding, but also in science, technology, engineering, and math, is one of the best ways of ensuring that we are going to be ready for the transformation of the workforce and the new technologies that are going to dominate our lives in the coming years. So yes, more math for everyone is a big priority for me. Thank you. Thank you. You, sir, sitting down on the stairs. Can't even get you a real seat, so there we are.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Mr. Prime Minister. Thank you for coming to Thunder Bay.
It's a pleasure to be back.
So I work as an educator. I'm also the public chair of the Crime Prevention Council for the City of Thunder Bay. So education and safety are prime issues to me. Every day in my role as an educator, I work with Indigenous families who have to send their families down to this city. They still don't have schools for their children up north. They send them to us, and we worry about their safety every day. We are very thankful through the Crime Prevention Council of the $5.6 million through Public Safety Canada that your government has provided to us, the City of Thunder Bay. I don't speak on behalf of them, but we're definitely thrilled with the program over the next 5 years of the Youth Inclusion Program, which is an innovative way for us to provide safety and supports and wraparound. But my big question is, what is your government going to do to help these Indigenous families so that they don't have to send their kids down to us every day?
Listen, thank you. Thank you for your question, and thank you for your dedication. This is something that really, really matters. Making sure that kids in Indigenous communities and from Indigenous communities have the same quality of education of anyone elsewhere in the country really, really matters. And it doesn't just matter to those Indigenous communities, but because there are so many, there's such a high population of Indigenous youth across this country, it's about the future of this whole country, not just Indigenous Canadians, that we make sure that they are properly empowered to be the leaders, the engineers, the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the successful community members that we know every single human being wants to be as they grow up. They want to contribute to their community, to their society, to their world, like everyone does. And we need to make sure that's happened. So over the first couple of years, we made a lot of investments to start to close the gap between the per student amount of funding in Indigenous schools versus the per student amount of funding in provincial schools. We were way under on Indigenous students, and we've managed to level off and close that gap. But it's not just a question of money, it's a question of facilities, and it's a question of safety. First of all, one of the things that we are doing right now is moving forward on historic child and family services legislation that is going to go a significant way towards stopping the practice of pulling kids who are at risk out of their communities and having them lose their culture, lose their language, lose their identity, because we know that is a path that has compounded the terrible errors and actions of generations past. We're moving forward on giving Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations control over the well-being of their own kids so that they can stay in their communities when they're in situations at risk. And various provinces have a differing need for that, but we know Manitoba, for example, has an extraordinary number of Indigenous kids in care, and that's absolutely something we have to fix, and that's what we are fixing by having co-developed legislation with Indigenous communities to make sure that we're putting an end to what has been described as residential schools in a different way, which is taking kids out of their communities and putting them in foster home that doesn't teach them their language, doesn't support their culture, doesn't know anything about how to raise them in a way that is true to their identity. So that's a big piece of it. But we also have the challenge of not just money, not just emergency services, but basic education. And that's why over the past few years, with the money we've invested, we've managed to open up many new Indigenous schools, and one of the most recent ones, there's a big announcement, a $42 million high school in KI. That means that kids will no longer have to leave that community to go to high school. There are more we're going to do, there are more we're going to be building, but obviously in communities that want it, that feel it's important to them, we need to make sure there are schools so they don't have to go away and put themselves at risk. There will be some who still do, and we need to make sure we have the programs to keep them safe as they come to larger centers or have to leave home to go to get their education. But there are a lot of things we're doing. There are a lot of things we're going to continue to do. And while we do that, we're going to be relying on extraordinary educators and leaders like you to make sure they get the very best. Thank you. Another question. You. Yes, it's you.
Hello, my name is Forrest Awanis, and I'm from Sandy Lake First Nation. I'm a student here studying primary junior education. There has been serious incidents involving children in reserves ever since the start of residential school and continued after the last one was closed. In the last 5 years, as you may or may not know, in the reserve, Sandy Lake, there was a man who raped and abused young boys for at least 20 years. Other things that have happened were a father sexually assaulted his 6-year-old daughter just last semester. And in Casablanca First Nation, a 5-year-old girl was left for dead after being beaten, raped, and stabbed by a group of young boys. In most recent incidents, in this past Wednesday, a young child was beheaded by a man who was mentally ill. I could go on and on about the horrific things that have happened in reserves, but I could take all day. So I ask, what do you plan on doing for the mental health of Indigenous people in the North? If there are teachers who are willing to live in the North to teach for the academic year, there shouldn't be an issue with providing mental health workers in the North.
Thank you. Thank you for your courage and your strength in sharing that with us. I think Canadians need to hear that. I think we need to be reminded constantly that we're not the country we like to think of ourselves as. Not yet. That even though we can be proud of Canada on all sorts of different levels for things that we do, for progress we've made, for an example we give to the world in so many different ways, there are still so many ways we fall short. And nowhere is that clearer than the continued challenges being faced in Indigenous communities right across this country. We talk about the word reconciliation an awful lot. And a lot of people think of that as, okay, that's the government, the federal government, making right and fixing the broken relationship of the past decades, generations, centuries with Indigenous peoples. And yes, that's a big piece of it. But it's not just about the federal government and Indigenous Canadians. It's about all of us. It's about non-Indigenous Canadians as well, and our understanding of what is still going on in our midst. The kinds of things that if they happened even in a big city like Toronto or Vancouver would be screaming headlines for weeks, and that are collectively still met far too often with shrugs because it happened in those communities. Well, that's unacceptable. And we have an awful lot to do. We have investments that we need to make in mental health, absolutely. And we are making more, but there's always more to do. But it's not just a question of mental health. It's a question of investment in housing that is adequate and safe and not overcrowded. It's a question of investing in jobs and job opportunities, in entrepreneurship and education, in healthcare, and supports to counter some of the intergenerational trauma where there are too many people who had their kids or who were themselves taken away from their parents as kids in residential school and never got to see what active, engaged parenting is and carry trauma that is echoing through generations. These are things that are going on in our backyard. As we look at that Canadian flag amongst nations in the world and we say, how aren't we proud to be Canadian? We have to take the beam out of our own eye. And that's why reconciliation is such a big issue for this government and for Canadians. We have invested billions upon billions of dollars and will continue to, but it's not just about money. It's also going to take time, but it's also going to take efforts, acknowledgement, awareness, and outrage from regular Canadians who have to say this can't continue. We need to do more. We need to invest more. We need to partner more. We need to listen more. But the one thing we can't do is sort of sit back and say, as we have tried in the past, however well-meaning, is to say, well, this is the solution. This is how we're going to fix it. I'm from Ottawa. I'm here to help. The solutions, the only solutions that can be truly lasting, need to be developed and built in partnership with those communities. And that means taking the time to build capacity, to learn, to grow, to create abilities to develop solutions that are suitable for every different community. And there are lots of inspirations, communities, Indigenous communities across the country, from different parts of the country, who've solved different angles of challenges that different parts of the country are facing. And our capacity to continue to draw, to grow, to be alarmed and outraged at things that continue to happen, and always look to do better and support and put an end to the kind of cycles of violence and pain that have continued for far too long, is something that we all have a role in. It's easy to shrug. It's easy to distance yourself from that, but we're Canadians. We need to be there for each other. We need to be outraged for each other, and we need to support each other and find these solutions. And that is what we are beginning to do. But there's a lot more work ahead of us, and we just have to keep redoubling our efforts. Thank you very much for sharing that. Thank you. Next question. You, sir, in the sunglasses on the hat. There you go. Yep.
Hi, Mr. Prime Minister. Thank you for taking my question.
You're welcome.
In the U.S., a year ago, they changed the business depreciation so that businesses can write off equipment and capital expenditures immediately, rather than depreciate them over time like we do here in Canada. Why didn't the government try to match this type of write-off, since it puts Canadian businesses at a disadvantage if they're in competition with the U.S.?
That's a great question. The U.S. made a number of big tax changes over the past couple of years, one of which was to decrease significantly their corporate income tax rate, so it got a lot closer to where Canada was. Now, Canada has long had an advantage over the United States in having significantly lower corporate taxes than the U.S., and we've benefited from that. And when the U.S. decided to drive down its corporate taxes, and incidentally massively drive up its deficit and its debt, we took a very serious look at how to be competitive. Now, what you're talking about is an accelerated capital cost allowance. What it means is if a company invests in a new piece of machinery, instead of writing off its depreciation or its value over the course of its life, you get to actually write it off right away when you buy it. And basically, it's an incentive to companies to invest in new machinery, new equipment, new productivity enhancing in capital investments quicker. And we know that leads to better jobs, better productivity, better economic growth in a really, really tangible way. It's something that Canada has had in place in a few different areas over time. But you're right, the United States took a big step forward in making that system much more generous. So we listened to businesses, We listened to corporate leaders and investors who said, this is something we should really do. And we did it. In the fall economic statement, we invested $14 billion in increasing the accelerated capital cost allowance and applying it to all sorts of different sectors of the economy, with a special focus on technology investments and R&D into high-tech renewables, because we know we really want people investing in that. And I'm happy to say that Canada, on a competitivity scale, is continuing to keep pace with and be very competitive with the United States, because we need to. But you brought up a great idea, and I was very happy to make sure that it got done in our fall economic statement just about 3 or 4 months ago. But I'm happy to tell you about it here today. Thank you. You, sir, in the beard.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for coming to Thunder Bay. My name is Don McLeod, and I sent you a letter about 3 or 4 months ago, and I told you if you come to Thunder Bay, I'd buy you lunch. I heard you were coming, and I said, oh, God, now I got to buy him lunch.
Sorry. I arrived around 1 in the afternoon, so you just got lucky. You just missed it.
So anyways, the reason that I'm standing here now is Louise and I and a number of other people are working very hard to try and save the power plant in Thunder Bay. We feel it's a complete waste of money and tax money to throw it away, because we're going to lose tax coming into the city. Tax base is going to go down. There's a number of things that are going to happen. I know at this point it's not a federal issue until we can get some investors there. I'd like to announce right now that we may have some coming. But I would like to get a commitment from you, sir, to have your government work with the provincial government and the municipal government, and let's do something here. We believe that we can bring 1,500 jobs to Northwestern Ontario, and fresh food and all the other stuff that we're trying to do there. I have a document here for you. I gave one to Kate for you already today, so would you commit to reading it and give us a shout back?
I will absolutely commit to reading it. What kind of power plant is it? What kind of power plant is it?
The Ontario generating station on Mission Island here.
Yes, but is it coal-based, or is it natural gas, or firewood?
Advanced biomass.
Okay, biomass.
They were buying their pellets from Norway, and we believe the technology is here. We can make it right here in Thunder Bay, and in turn, to supply the plant, we would need 8 pellet plants in Northwestern Ontario being built, and those could be in all the little towns that have the sawmills shut down, and we can get the economy going all over Northwestern Ontario. And why is our gas prices so darn high? And one other thing.
Listen, Don, absolutely, I pledge I will take a look at the document. I'm glad we have a copy, and we're always looking for solutions on the energy front. We know that we need to make sure we are innovating and supporting our communities and our businesses as best we can, and looking for more renewable ways of powering our economy. We don't know what the solution is going to be yet, so we need to be investing in all sorts of different ways to try and develop the paths towards different solutions, and I'm very interested in looking at it and finding out more. There's a few more people, and we're starting to run out of time, so I'll get to others. Thank you. Someone from the back corner there. Looking for you, ma'am, in the second row.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, my name is Robin. I'm a student, small business person, visual artist. Thank you for coming. And I really appreciate the opportunity to disagree with you.
Oh, excellent.
The environment, it's not a resource. The environment is what gives us life. And the economy is not in conflict with the environment. The economy is a tool that humans have developed, and we can adapt the economy to suit what we need to sustain life on the planet.
So far, we agree 100%.
It's 1.5 to stay alive. As you say, climate change is real. But climate leaders don't buy pipelines. The tar sands have been killing people downstream for over 10 years from cancer. We never hear about that. But there's a living community of Indigenous people there. I'm speaking as a settler, and I am deeply ashamed that I live in a culture that will allow the planet to be raped and people to be killed and not accounted for. We need to stop doing things that harm human life and that infringe upon the rights of nature. We're not going to survive. We need for you, all of you leaders, to use your leadership skills to bring unity to us. We are in a very dangerous situation now where people are so instilled with fear because we are clinging onto an economy that no longer works. We need you to bring us together seeking a peace economy that respects the planet. How can you use your skills at disagreeing and at being willing to say no? You're willing to go back on your campaign promises on proportional representation and other things. Can you not go back on your promise of the pipelines?
Thank you for that, for your question and your perspective, and I entirely understand it, and I entirely appreciate it. I feel the urgency of making sure we are fighting climate change as effectively and as quickly as possible. We absolutely have to. So the question is not whether we have to do it, but it's how we have to do it and how we can actually do it. We are an economy right now that is still reliant on fossil fuels. Our systems, I mean, there's probably a number of you in here who came here in electric cars, but most of you still came here in gas-powered vehicles. And trucks, yes, okay. We still rely on heating oil and natural gas to heat our homes massively across the country. We are a country that needs air conditioning in the summer because our summers are wonderfully warm, and we need to heat our homes in the winter. We are continuing to rely on the old ways of doing things. And we need to figure out how to do things differently as quickly as possible. We need to change, the emission profile of not just our country, but our world effectively and rapidly if we're going to keep away from the 1.5 degree of warming. So the question becomes, how do we do that? And it's lovely to talk about bringing people together and just doing it, but a government has to actually create mechanisms for that to happen. We actually have to create opportunities for people to vote for a plan to make that happen. And we are still, unfortunately, in a country where the big debate in the next election is likely to be, at least in part, whether or not we have to put a price on pollution in this country. So I hear the people who say we should just go all the way tomorrow and shut down the oil sands and get off of oil and park our cars and take our bikes to work. But we can't do that tomorrow. Can we do that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Sure. We can move towards it significantly. Can we start developing innovations that get us off our significant reliance on fossil fuels in the short term? Yes, we can. And in places that have brought in a price on pollution, as we are about to, we have seen, like BC, we have seen immediate and significant changes in pollution, in emissions, and in corporate behaviors that has made a significant difference. But I know that if I tell millions of Canadians that we're going to make a radical change and you're no longer going to be able to afford to fill your cars, you're no longer going to be able to afford to heat your homes because we have to protect the planet, we won't end up doing any of that. We will continue to put this challenge off till the next generations. So what we have put forward as a plan, and I hear very clearly there are some people who think it's not ambitious enough. There are some people who think it's way too ambitious. The reality is, I think that it is real in that it will change our emissions profile. It will reduce our emissions. It will incentivize investments in solutions and new technologies that will create those positive feedback loops we need to start creating not the jobs of yesterday, but the jobs of tomorrow, that are going to understand that being innovative and green and cleaner is going to make a huge difference in the world. Now, when I understand the ease with which certain people say climate leaders don't build pipelines or don't buy pipelines, I understand that. It's a very easy thing to say. And it'd be lovely to imagine that if we could shut down the oil sands tomorrow, which we won't and we shouldn't, that somehow the planet would be saved. But that's not the way to save the planet from climate change. The way to save the planet from climate change is to develop solutions, technologies, practices, habits of individual consumers and habits of life that pollute less. And government's responsibility is to make that change affordable for people. Everyone wants to see a cleaner environment. Everyone wants their kids to be able to have summers on the lake the way we did as we were kids. Everyone wants to know that the environment is protected, but we need to know that we're going to be able to do it in a way that doesn't cause us massive damage now to our livelihoods, to the things we do. So a perfect example is the fact that we recognize that zero-emission vehicles, electric vehicles, all electric vehicles, are still more expensive than regular combustion vehicles. So as a government, we've said in this budget, if you buy an electric vehicle that's worth $45,000 as a market price or less, so you don't get the Teslas for that, we will give you $5,000 off it, to make it slightly more competitive, so that more people buy it, but also so that the technology continues to develop, so that companies understand that investing in those is a good path. We are going to make sure that we are supporting and making this fight against climate change affordable for Canadians, because if we don't, we won't actually move anywhere near the direction that we have to. And I know people are impatient, I'm impatient too. But if we don't have multiple chances to do this. Successive governments have put this off for decades until it's landed on us right now. And if we don't get this right now, if we don't start significantly reducing our emissions now, we will not make it. And I think this is a case where if we push too far, too fast, we won't actually go anywhere. We need to do it manageably in a way that supports families and pushes the envelope as quickly as Canadians are able to. And I know that our capacity to innovate, to work hard, to create those solutions, not just for us, but for the world, is what is going to carry us through. I am tremendously optimistic about that. But thank you very much for sharing your passion. You, ma'am. Yes.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for being here and taking my question. My question has to do with the Globe and Mail's report that was published a full 2 years ago on February the 3rd, 2017, about the national statistics on the cases of unfounded sexual assaults. Well, I don't know if you're aware, but the national rates was 1 in 5 cases being dismissed by any woman who is brave enough to go forward with an allegation. In Northwestern Ontario, the 20% rate was appalling, but in Northwestern Ontario, Rainy River District, we see 35% were dismissed, the same as in Red Lake, 32% in Sioux Lookout, and a ridiculous 43% of all cases were dismissed in Kenora. So that's nearly 1 out of every 2. Clearly, Northwestern Ontario has a significant problem, since these statistics are appalling, considering the fact that only 1 out of every 10 victims even goes forward to the police, and then to have nearly half of those cases not even investigated. The victim is told she's not credible. Where does Canada stand on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, particularly goal number 5 of gender equality, when these are the undeniable facts? You are a self-proclaimed feminist. Are you not as outraged as I am over these undeniable facts? What have you and or your government done over the last 2 years since this report was first out to address this dangerous reality for women? And what are you planning to do to improve the situation for sexual assault victims, particularly in Northwestern Ontario?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I am outraged, and as soon as that report came out, as a government, we tasked the RCMP, which is the police force that the federal government has responsibility over, to immediately start responding to that, to look at its practices and protocols, and try and ensure that these statistics start to change significantly, because it is a problem that affects the RCMP as well as other police forces. Further to that, we are looking at the justice system and how we can actually make changes to encourage and allow people to come forward and actually feel like they are getting heard, and that there are consequences for sexual assault and sexual harassment. But it's not a problem that is just in the realm of criminal behaviors and the justice system. It's also a societal problem. Harassment in the workplace, intimidation, misogyny, holding back and marginalization of women and other groups, because we have a system that continues to perpetuate inequalities within it that need to be addressed. I am a feminist, and that means that, and anyone in this room who thinks that men and women should be equal and thinks there's a lot more work to do gets to be a feminist too. So I think that's most of us in this room. But labels are easy. Action is hard. Action is important. And that's where the things that we have done as a government on this and on other things are things that we continue to take very seriously, from naming of the first gender-balanced cabinet in Canadian federal history, to the significant move of putting a GBA plus lens on everything we do as a government with the last budget, which continues into this budget. Understanding that gender equality is not just the right or good thing to do, it's also the very smart thing to do. You can't have a society succeed if you continue to hold back or minimize the success of half of its population. We've moved forward on historic proactive pay equity legislation that is going to make a significant difference in something that, despite Canada's goodness on a number of different levels, we are among the worst of our allies in terms of actual gender equality, pay equity in terms of women in the workplace. We also have taken that onto the international stage, where last year we were we had the presidency of the G7, which is the grouping of the most developed nations in the world. And every G7, you have different themes you put forward. We, for example, put one theme on fighting ocean plastics and cleaning up our oceans, which was very successful. We had a session on that. And we wanted the other theme to be gender equality, but we didn't want to just spend an hour as leaders discussing it. We wanted it to be, for the first time, a horizontal priority. So we made sure that every single ministerial meeting that happened during the year of our presidency of the G7, there was a gender lens or a gender perspective put on that meeting, from economics to security to the environment to all the different issues we were dealing with as a G7. We put forward a Gender Equality Advisory Council that was part of all those decisions, and that's something that France, that is the president this year, has continued to commit to. And actually, we had that council bring forward the top recommendation we could do for the world, which was invest in education for women and girls in crisis and conflict-affected states around the world. Education for those women and girls was probably the biggest thing that was needed, and we managed to collect $3.8 billion from the group around the table to lift hundreds of millions of women out of poverty and out of lack of education in conflict states. So there are a lot of things that we've done, and there's a lot more to do. And the issue of sexual harassment is one that I have taken seriously all my life. My very first volunteer involvement, actually, when I was in university, back in the early 90s at McGill, I was one of the earliest male members of the Sexual Assault Center of the McGill Student Society, part of their outreach program that went out talking about date rape on campuses and the importance of communication and respect and the kinds of things that, unfortunately, 25 years later, are still very much unaddressed and very much too much of a reality on campuses right across the country, which is part of why last year we put forward significant money directly focused on universities and universities programming to counter sexual violence and sexual harassment on campus. There's a lot of things we do, including continue to address the unfounded issue that, you're right, hasn't been properly addressed yet, and it is a very complex issue we continue to work on, but it is something we will continue to work on because it's the right thing to do. Thank you very much. And the last question of the night, you, sir, the enthusiastic one with the mustache.
Years ago, we used to be privileged to see your father come here as Prime Minister. It was great. Now we see you here, also as Prime Minister. Maybe someday we'll see one of your children as Prime Minister.
Oh, I would not wish that on them. That's...
You touched briefly on housing and First Nations. We're privileged to work in a wonderful community. It's called Kingfisher Lake First Nations. Wonderful, wonderful leadership. Chief Eddie does a wonderful job. You see, very responsible. But money for housing is very tight. We see, like a while ago, there was in Cass Lake a big crisis. Seamus stepped up, came out with a big checkbook, and that's great. But what can we do to make it more responsible for merit-based housing? I see some of the sometimes when the houses get destroyed or there's problems, the money gets spent. Then there's the responsible family. You see some of them, they work hard, they really wonderful, they work, they're very responsible, but they live in an old house. What if we could get merit-based moving ahead? A low-interest mortgage. The more you contribute to your community, the harder you work, the more your kids go to school, because the kids are the future, the faster your house will get paid for. Because when you get ownership of your house, they're going to take care of it. You get the people that really invest in their home. It's an old little house. We go in there, it's immaculate. We go into a new house, it was 12 years old, totally trashed. Windows were out, nobody cared. So I really would impose upon you, if you could just merit-based, I would challenge you to the wonderful community of Kingfisher. Work with Patty. Give us a couple $1 million bucks, merit-based. We could make the money go farther. And Patty's wonderful. She will work with us. So I would challenge you, double dare you. A couple $1 million for Kingfisher First Nations, and we'll make the money go farther. But merit-based would go so far.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. We know that housing insecurity and concerns about housing affordability and affordable housing is a reality right across the country, from small Indigenous communities to our biggest cities. Canadians are worried about the cost of housing, worried about being able to access affordable housing and housing that is affordable for them. One of the things that we did as a government was get the federal government back in the business of investing in housing. The federal government had stepped away under the previous government from investing in housing, and we put forward a $40 billion national housing strategy that is all about making investments right across the country in housing, in affordable housing, in co-op housing, in making a difference in that way. But you're absolutely right. A lot of that goes to the situations most in crisis, or where the need is most pressing. And one of the conversations I've had many, many times over these past years is often young families trying to start out who find that they just don't have the money to put down for a down payment or pay for their mortgage. And we're finding a delay in the statistics in terms of when millennials are actually buying their homes. And as you say, once you've purchased your home and you start to develop equity, you are working towards financial stability and retirement, and your eventual retirement, in a way that is a really important part of the economic stability of our country. So we asked ourselves the question specifically for this budget: what could we do to help millennials specifically buy their first home sooner? And now the housing market is a tricky thing, right? Because if we just decide we're going to write a check for, $10,000 or whatever it is to every millennial out there, well, you're just going to find housing prices will go up by $10,000 for everyone out there. So there's a lot of things there are a lot of ways where you can try to do something that actually won't help in terms of making your first home more affordable. So what we actually did is create something that I'm pretty excited about, which is the first-time home buyers incentive, which actually means that if you're making less than a collected family income of $120,000 a year, which is most millennials, and you want to buy your first home, the government will pay for 5% of it. We will buy 5% of your home. Actually, 10% if it's a brand new build, which will incentivize people to build more homes. And therefore, you will have to put less down as a down payment, and your monthly mortgage payments could be hundreds of dollars less every month. What it does is makes it significantly easier, not a huge, infinite, massive amount, but for families that are getting close to being able to buy their home, they will be able to buy their home sooner, get into that market sooner, and have that stability as we're moving forward. So having the government help you with buying that first home is good, not just for young people who need it, but for the communities they live in and for the economies they will be contributing to for many, many years until they retire partially on the equity they were able to build up from owning their own homes. That is one example of how a government that really truly believes in its capacity to invest in the right ways in people, invest in the right ways in our communities, and build better solutions so that everyone has a real and fair chance to succeed. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Thank you so much for being part of this tonight.